So does it feel weird to anybody else to say Wikipedia in this day and age? I feel like it's so outdated. Or maybe it's just me. I don't know. I feel like you say Wikipedia, right after that you say I'm going home to play Super Nintendo or Atari or NES or Sega Genesis. I don't know. Wikipedia. But anyway, this video here is the 10 creepy Wikipedia pages on disturbing individuals. Let's check it out.
History is filled with creepy and strange individuals, and many of them will never have their stories told to the general public. Thankfully, with the likes of Wikipedia, we can begin to go down the rabbit hole of these scary individuals and their disturbing backstories. Number 10. Jean de Clisson earned the nickname of the Lioness of Brittany for her ferocious actions as a pirate during the 100 Years' War. She wasn't motivated by greed or a thirst for power. She wanted revenge on the French king and was as terrifying as possible in order to achieve that. De Clisson's story began as far away from a life of piracy as possible. She was born into a noble family in Brittany and married well. Her husband passed when she was still young, and de Clisson married twice more. Her third husband, Olivier de Clisson, came in 1330. He was a wealthy nobleman, but the marriage wasn't only for political reasons. The two got on well together, and the couple had 5 children. Not long into their marriage, the 100 Years' War began. The conflict between England and France would encompass many smaller wars, including the War of Breton Succession. Taking place in Brittany, this was obviously close to home for the de Clissons, and Olivier de Clisson had to pick sides. Olivier was loyal to the French crown and fought on the side of the House of Blois against the English and Montfort forces. He was one of the commanders in the town of Vannes, which came under siege multiple times. In 1342, the town was finally overwhelmed, and Olivier and the other commanders were captured. Normally, during medieval warfare, noble prisoners would be ransomed back, but in Olivier's case, the English wanted the exchange of prisoners as well. The exchange went ahead, and Olivier returned home to his wife and children. Unfortunately for the de Clissons, that wouldn't be the end of the story. The French king, Philip VI, was obviously worried about his nobles acting against him. For some reason, he came to suspect Olivier and the other barons at Vannes as working with the English. There seems to have been no evidence for this, but later historians wrote of alleged correspondence between the barons and the English nobility. Despite the lack of evidence, the king was convinced of the plot. Olivier and the other barons were arrested and went through a trial. Even without evidence, they were found guilty and were set to lose their lives for the crime. Jean attempted to break her husband out of prison, but was caught before he could escape. That meant she was also now an outlaw. Olivier's punishment went ahead, and his body was put on display as a warning to others who might have thought of acting against the king. Jean took her wealth and raised a force of 400 men. She used this force to attack castles and settlements loyal to the crown. Each time, one person was left as a survivor to carry her message of revenge back to the king. Her most famous acts of revenge would later come on the water. She took her children to England, where she purchased a fleet of warships. These were painted black and had red sails designed to inflict fear from a distance. For 13 years,
they really pissed her off, right? Like, she really mounted up, soldiered up. Like, world, they say, man, don't piss off a woman, fam, because she knows no bounds. Like, and you hear this, a woman scorned and different sayings and stuff like that. This is a true testament of that, bro. Jeez.
Black Fleet would harass merchants and sailors off the coast of Brittany and in the English Channel. De Clisson would only attack French vessels and made sure each time that one person was left alive to bring her message back to the king. Jean de Clisson became one of the most feared names of the time, and more than earned her nickname of Lioness of Brittany. But after 13 years, she suddenly retired from her life of piracy and settled down in England, marrying an English noble and living a quiet life far removed from her life of piracy. Number 9. The word thug entered the English language in the early 19th century. in part due to the actions of one terrifying individual. While he may not be well known today, the man known as Thug Behram was one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Behram was born around 1765 in northern India, and he was apparently a shy child, but that changed when he was introduced to a Thuggee gang. The Thuggees were gangs of criminals who would prey on travelers. The exact origins of the group is something of a mystery, but by the 16th century they were spread across the Indian subcontinent. The gangs were named after the Sanskrit word for concealment, due to the terrifying nature of their attacks. One or two members of the gang would infiltrate a party of travelers, waiting until they'd gained their trust before calling upon the rest of the gang and attacking them. The Thuggees would take the lives of their victims using a type of ceremonial handkerchief known as a rumal. What made these gangs stand out from typical highwaymen was the cult nature of the attacks. The thugs allegedly believed themselves to be the children of the goddess Kali, who is associated with change, creation, destruction, and death. The thugs weren't simply taking the lives of people in their eyes, they were giving them to Kali. Behram was introduced to one of these groups and quickly rose through the ranks. By the time he was 25, he'd already taken the lives of many individuals. He would soon come up with an innovative way of committing the crimes. He sewed a gold coin or medallion into his handkerchief. When this was pressed against a victim's Adam's apple, it restricted the airways even more. Behram would become one of the most terrifying thugs in the region, earning the nickname King of Thugs and leading his own gang. They would communicate through jackal calls, which would often be the last things victims heard before they were betrayed by members of the gang that had infiltrated their party. Some sources claim that Behram's gang would leave none alive, but others say that he had a code of conduct. No women would be harmed, the Muslim Sufis and people with leprosy would also be spared. During Behram's reign...
What about children? Like, you didn't care about children at all? And then another thing is, I wonder if people who consider themselves thugs today know the origin of where that word actually came from. And if they would continue to keep it, knowing from which it came. They probably would, knowing them, but I just want to know, do they know where it came from now that I know where it came from?
Reign of Terror, British rule in India became stronger. British travelers were attacked in the same way that native Indians were, and the authorities aimed to wipe out the threat from Thuggee gangs once and for all. In the 1830s, Captain William Henry Seaman was put in charge of dealing with the threat from Thuggee gangs. He was appointed the superintendent of the Thug Police and set about trying to capture Behram, who was now in his 70s but remained one of the most dangerous people in the country. Multiple investigations failed to capture Behram, so Seaman turned to those closest to him. One of Behram's closest allies was a man named Saeed Amir Ali, who'd been with Behram since he first entered the gang. Seaman managed to capture Ali's family and held them hostage until Ali would become an informant. Ali gave him locations where Behram typically hung out, and it was at one of these that the notorious criminal was finally captured. Exactly how many lives Behram took is unclear. He's said to have witnessed over 900, but how many of those he was directly responsible for is unclear. Behram confessed to taking the lives of 125 people, which alone would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in the world. Number 8. Said to be one of the inspirations for the dark tale of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there were definitely two sides to scientist John Hunter. On the one hand, he changed medicine forever with his insistence on experimentation and the scientific method, and made many discoveries that are still significant today. On the other hand, his pursuit of knowledge struck fear in the hearts of people who would later be part of his museum. Hunter was born in 1728 as the 10th child in an ordinary Scottish family. He didn't do well at school, but had a natural curiosity that was difficult to satiate. When he was 20, he moved to London to study under his brother, who was a successful doctor and anatomy teacher. William Hunter's school was one of the most highly regarded in the region, as they always seemed to have a supply of fresh corpses for the students to dissect and study. In a time before X-rays, this was really the only way doctors could learn what was going on inside the human body. John Hunter excelled at dissection, and would soon surpass his brother in terms of both talent and fame. His natural curiosity continued, and he now had the ability to find out the answers for himself. Hunter would conduct experiments to try to learn more about different ailments and their treatments. Whether he experimented on himself or his patients is unclear, but he helped to make advancements in the understanding of various diseases. One of the discoveries he made was that bullets don't poison the area around the wound. When he served as a surgeon in the army, this discovery drastically changed recovery outcomes for many of his patients. He also argued that removing limbs should only be done as a last resort. His reputation meant that he was a doctor to many wealthy individuals, and in 1776, he was appointed as surgeon to King George III. Many of his wealthy clients would come to his home for treatment. It was at this house that the two sides of John Hunter sat side by side. The house was actually two separate houses, joined by a purpose-built lecture theater. One side faced the respectable neighborhood of Leicester Square, and the other side, a shabbier side, faced the Charing Cross Road. On this side of the house, students would lodge, and late at night, the resurrection men would come to visit. In the 1700s, there was no legal way for private anatomy schools to acquire corpses, but it was an important factor for the students' education. William Hunter, and later his brother John, employed the help of so-called resurrection men, or grave robbers. They would bring freshly buried remains from paupers' graveyards. It was something of an open secret, and this is how the surgeons of tomorrow were getting their education. John Hunter became known for paying well for bodies, especially those that were unusual or interesting. Sometimes he sought out those bodies while their owners were still alive. So-called freak shows were popular at the time, and Hunter saw the performers there as potential future specimens. When he heard that a performer was ill, he would be waiting to sweep in and take the body as soon as the person passed away. On 2 occasions, he actually stole the bodies of performers. In 1806, Patrick Cotter O'Brien passed away. Patrick was over 8 feet tall and known as the Bristol Giant. He was scared of his body being dissected after his passing and asked to be buried under 12 feet of concrete. Hunter stole the body before that could happen, but was later forced to return it. Years earlier, a similar thing had happened to Charles Byrne. Charles went by the stage name of the Irish Giant and wished to be buried at sea to stop Hunter or anybody else from getting their hands on his remains. But Hunter bribed a member of the funeral party and stole the body on the way to the coast. Charles was dissected and became part of Hunter's museum. In the same home he shared with his wife and children, Hunter had a museum of over 14,000 human, animal, and plant specimens. After Hunter himself passed away, his collection came into the possession of the Royal College of Surgeons. Many of these specimens are still on display. Charles Byrne's skeleton is still part of the collection, but was removed from the display in 2023. Number 7. With a lot of historical figures, it's difficult to figure out just how many of their disturbing acts actually happened, and how much of their story is later historians twisting the narrative. That's most often the case with female figures, and is evident in the story of Empress Wutian. It's likely that China's only female ruling emperor committed some horrifying acts on her way to the throne, and when she was ruling the country. But figuring out just how much truth there is to every disturbing story is much harder. Wu was the daughter of a wealthy timber merchant who became a close ally of Li Yuan. Shortly before Wu's birth, Li Yuan had overthrown the Sui dynasty and was now ruling as Emperor Gaozu of Tang. Gifts were bestowed on her family, who remained close to Gaozu throughout his reign. When she was still young, Wu entered the imperial palace as a concubine. She was relatively low level and would have had limited interactions with the emperor. One of the people she saw more often, though, was the emperor's son, the future Emperor Taizong. In 626, Gaozu passed away, and Taizong took the throne. At the time, it was customary for all the previous emperors' concubines to be confined to a temple and live the rest of their lives as nuns. But Taizong had already taken an interest in Wu, who was much closer to his age than his father's. He would frequently go to visit her at the temple and make comments about how he could get her out of there if he wanted to. Meanwhile, Taizong already had an empress and multiple concubines. His favorite was a woman named Zhao, who'd given him multiple children. Taizong's wife, Empress Wei, was jealous of the other woman and encouraged Wu to persuade Taizong to break her out of the temple. The empress had wanted to get rid of Zhao, but all she did was add another rival to the palace. As well as her beauty, Wu was extremely clever and knew how to get what she wanted. She also gave Taizong children.
That sounds familiar. I think you just summed up pretty much all women that are pretty clever and know how to get what they want. All you got to do is just I don't know, scroll up and down Twitter or Instagram. You'll see it. Trust me.
She managed to convince the emperor that his empress had hurt one of the children, and he removed Wang from power. She also had the favored concubine removed from power, so that she was the only person who had Taizong's ear. According to legend, she had the two other women brutally wounded and placed in wine barrels. Once she was at Taizong's side, she wasted no time in increasing her influence. She dealt with nobles and advisors who brutally opposed her. Many lost their lives, while their families also suffered. She would eventually be deposed in 705, a few months before she passed away, and her older son reclaimed the throne. Ever since then, her legacy and story have been manipulated and shrouded in mystery, making the truth hard to distinguish today.
Can never trust a pretty face and a smile. That girl was poison. Sounds like a song. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? Nah, seriously though, she was crazy.
Number 6. In 1987, the documentary film The Emperor's Naked Army Marches On was released. The film follows former soldier Kinzo Okuzaki as he tries to get answers and justice for fellow soldiers who lost their lives during the Second World War. The film sheds light on a disturbing story that Japanese society was trying to ignore. Kinzo Okuzaki was born in 1920 to a family affected by the Great Depression. He had to leave school at 10 and was then drafted at the age of 21 into the military as part of the engineering corps. He spent time first in China, helping to build bridges and roads in occupied territories before he was transferred in 1943 to the newly formed 2nd Company of the 36th Independent Engineering Regiment. At the time, Japan's war effort seemed to be going well. It had acted fast in the opening stages of the Pacific War and took over land and islands across the entire Southwest Pacific. But it wasn't problem-free. In 1942, the Japanese military started a campaign on East New Guinea, which had gone disastrously. The military didn't learn any lessons from the campaign, and in March of 1943, the 18th Army landed on the island. The group included 1,200 soldiers from the 36th Independent Engineering Regiment, one of which was Okuzaki. Okuzaki would later write about his horrifying experience in New Guinea. The engineering regiment was supposed to build an airfield, but even getting to the location was difficult, and many of the soldiers started to suffer from diseases. Even though the airfield was built, it didn't see much use. By now, the Allied forces had control of their air and sea, and the airfield became a target for bombardment. The call eventually came through to abandon the airfield and retreat, first to a base 400 kilometers away, and then to another base 400 kilometers away in Hollandia. The trek was extremely dangerous. The soldiers suffered from a lack of food and tropical diseases. Okuzaki was part of the reconnaissance group, which meant that he had the first access to any food caches they found. It helped him to stay alive, but isolated him from the rest of the group. By the time he made it to Hollandia, he was alone. Only 6 soldiers from the engineering regiment managed to survive New Guinea, including Okuzaki. He surrendered to Allied forces and spent the rest of the war in prison. After the war, Okuzaki tried to adjust to civilian life in Japan and started a car battery company. In 1956, Okuzaki accidentally took the life of a broker and a con man who'd stolen from him and spent 10 years behind bars. Most of that time was spent in solitary confinement, where Okuzaki focused his thoughts on the problems he saw in society. He was angry that the people he saw as responsible for the war didn't pay for their crimes. He saw the emperor system as against the new constitution that had been brought in after the war and damaging to ordinary citizens. He tried to go through legal means to get the matter heard, then turned to other methods. On January 2nd, 1969, Okuzaki fired pachinko balls at Emperor Hirohito during the public opening of the Tokyo Imperial Palace. He didn't want to hurt the emperor severely, and none of the pinballs reached him. He only wanted to draw attention to his cause and question the emperor in court over his actions during the war. Most newspapers dismissed Okuzaki as mentally unwell, and Hirohito didn't testify in court during the assault case. Oguzaki was sentenced to another year and a half in prison, but it didn't dampen his need for answers. He would spend the rest of his life confronting military officers and those who had authority during the war, and spent more time in prison after accidentally taking the life of the son of these people. He passed away in 2005 at the age of 85. Number 5. Igis Treichlin was an extraordinary man who conned and traveled his way across 3 continents in the first half of the 20th century. Figuring out who exactly Treichlin actually was is far more difficult than looking at who he claimed to be, which may be why this strange historical figure and his story are less well known. Treichlin was born to an Orthodox Jewish family in Hungary in 1879. He started his life of crime not long after he left school, and got into trouble for petty theft. Before he could face the consequences of these crimes, he sold a watch he had stolen from his sister's home, and used the money to purchase transport to Britain. It was here where Treich would reinvent himself for the first time, converting to Christianity and switching between 3 different forms of Protestantism. He managed to get a position doing missionary work in Canada, only to abandon that after a payment dispute. When he returned to England, he got a position as a parish priest, but it's hard to say just how much of his heart was in the job. All accounts of Treichlin claim that he'd been running con jobs and fraudulent schemes during this time, though it's hard to figure out just what those schemes were. Despite any reputation he might have had, he managed to come into contact with millionaire Sebum Rowntree.
Like, how do you run a scheme on God and religion? Like, that's got to be some of the lowest of the low. And I'm trying not to judge, but it just, I just can't shake that. How do people do that? Like, you hear, and it still goes on today, you hear people stealing from churches and doing different things like that. And the hardworking people that donate tithes and different things to church, man, it just always blows my mind to hear that. You know, I guess it's no different. You're a thief, you're a thief. It is what it is. It shouldn't make no difference whether it's church or anything else, I guess.
He might have had. He managed to come into contact with millionaire Sebum Rowntree and began to work as his private secretary. Rowntree managed to get Treichlin into politics, an area where he would spend most of his life. He briefly held a seat in the British Parliament, but lost the position at the following election.
I mean, I guess he'd be perfect for politics. He's a thief. You know, that's pretty much what makes up, I guess, a good politician. Let me shut up.
He also had a falling out with Rowntree by now, who discovered some of his friends' fraudulent schemes and wanted nothing to do with it. After a brief detour to the Balkans to attempt to start an oil business, Treichlin returned to Britain during World War I, where he worked as a censor. But it seems his allegiances lay with Germany, and he worked as a spy for the other nation. He fled to the US to avoid prosecution for espionage, only to then publish a book about his work. It wouldn't have been a surprise for anybody when he was arrested for fraud and sent back to the UK to serve a 3-year prison sentence. By now, Treichlin had developed a hatred for Britain, which was only made worse by the treaties of Versailles and Trianon, which he saw as unfair to the losing side of the war. Between the wars, he entrenched himself within right-wing politics in Germany and Hungary, but it still didn't seem as if this is where his heart was. He sold documents from the White International Forces, a loose confederation of anti-communists and monarchists that operated around Eastern Europe. That put another target on him, and he was arrested for treason in Austria, but was acquitted. Treichlin decided that it was time for a fresh start again and traveled to China. While there, he decided to become a Buddhist and quickly rose from monk to abbot. He used his position to gain wealth, as he required all those under him to give him their possessions. It wasn't long before his usual schemes took over, though. He made contact with German representatives in Japan and requested an audience with members of the German government. He wanted to try to convince them to end the war and intended to use his newfound mystical prowess to do so. The meeting never happened, and Treichlin ties with the German government came to a swift end. Number 4. King Ferdinand I of Naples ruled his kingdom for a little over 35 years. During that time, he became known as a patron of the arts and for completing numerous building projects. But he was also constantly at war and fighting off rivals for the throne. That led to a disturbing museum being created, where Ferdinand could take any potential threats to dissuade them. Italy, during the 1400s, was already a volatile place with many kingdoms, cities, and papal states all battling one another for power. Ferdinand's father, Alfonso V, had already had to fight for the throne and wasn't the direct descendant of any of his predecessors. That meant there would already have been a lot of people trying to get the kingdom back after Alfonso passed away. Ferdinand's succession was further complicated by the fact that he'd been born illegitimate, the son of Alfonso's mistress. Ferdinand had been taken in by his father and trained in the arts of politics and war. He was also legitimized and had the backing of 2 of the previous popes. But when it came to Ferdinand's coronation, things weren't as simple as had been hoped. There were multiple other claimants to the throne, and the new pope was not as welcoming of Ferdinand as the previous popes. Through political maneuvering and battles, Ferdinand managed to secure the throne, but his reign would not be problem-free. He made social laws that favored artisans and peasants, which in turn limited the power of his barons. In 1485, this led to a complete revolt, with barons taking over territory owned by the king and capturing one of Ferdinand's sons. They had the backing of the Pope, which only made fighting them more difficult. After months of battle, Ferdinand formed an alliance with Florence and Milan, finally quashing the revolution. Many of the barons and other rebels lost their lives after Ferdinand took back control, but the king still wanted revenge. He offered the remaining rebels amnesty and tricked them out of their stronghold. For a short while, it looked as if the whole event had been put behind them. The leaders of the conspiracy were the Count of Sarno and Antonello Petrucci, Ferdinand's secretary. They both managed to survive, but that would quickly change when they were both arrested at a wedding held for the children of the other counts. Others were also arrested and faced the rest of their lives in prison before having their lives taken. With so many enemies, it's not clear exactly when Ferdinand came up with the idea that he thought would best frighten anybody else into thinking of going against him. But at some point during his many fights to stay in control of his kingdom, he created what he would call the Black Museum. Ferdinand would have the bodies of his enemies embalmed and mummified, then dressed in their everyday outfits, and these mummies were then posed in various scenes in his macabre museum. If the king thought that someone was making plans to commit treason, he would simply take that individual on a guided tour of his museum.
Yo, that's a form of mind control like that I've ever heard, fam. Like this museum is created for the sole purpose to remind people not to mess with him, not to cross him, not to get on his bad side. Here, let me take you. Here, take a walk with me. Let me show you something real quick before you think about doing what you're thinking about. What? That's different, bro. I ain't never heard nothing like that before. That's different.
Showing off what had happened to the last people who had gone against him. Number 3. Jeang Yi was one of the most fearsome and successful pirates in history. She ran a confederation of between 40,000 and 60,000 soldiers and had hundreds of ships at her command. Operating between 1801 and 1810, she terrorized the Chinese authorities and anybody trying to do trade in the South China Sea, then retired for a quiet life in Guangdong. Around the year 1800, piracy in the South China Sea started to become more organized. What had once been something fishermen took part in during the off-season had become a full-time operation. Thousands of former fishermen had taken part in the Tay Son Wars in Vietnam, earning warfare experience and money to make a pirate life their full-time occupation. For a while, many of these different pirate fleets fought one another for supremacy, which allowed the Chinese government and European traders in the area to slip through. Eventually, they came together to form the Guangdong Pirate Confederation, led by Jeang Yi. Jeang Yi was part of a pirate family and at the head of the Red Flag Fleet and hundreds of ships and thousands of sailors under his command. In 1801, he married a woman named Shi Yang, who would then take on the name Jeang Yi Sao. Jeang Yi Sao was a competent businesswoman who had the skills to make the new Federation of Pirates a success. At this time, there was a lot of trade going on in the South China Sea, and every ship had to pass through the Federation's territory. If they wanted to pass through without being attacked, they had to pay a fee to the Federation, who would then issue passports to let other pirates know that this ship wasn't to be touched. Anybody that didn't pay the fee would be boarded and attacked. Lower-level sailors could escape with their lives, but anybody who worked for the government or military would meet a horrifying fate. In 1807, Jeang Yi passed away after going overboard in a storm. There was a possibility that the entire Federation would collapse without his leadership, but Jeang Yi Sao took the reins. For added authority, she married Jeang Yi's adopted son, Zhang Bao, who had become a successful pirate in his own right. With Jeang Yi Sao now at the helm, the Pirate Confederation went from success to success. She reformed the rules to become much harsher against pirates who disobeyed their superiors, or those that hurt captives. She also organized the distribution of the treasure that the Confederation captured, making sure everybody got a cut of the money. The Confederation was now stronger than ever, but also a bigger problem for the Chinese government. They tried to work with Portuguese ships to blockade Jeang Yi Sao, but she was able to make an escape with her personal fleet. But Jeang Yi Sao and the other pirates knew their success wouldn't last forever. By 1810, the government came up with a new way to rid itself of the pirate problem. They would simply pay pirates to retire. Some had already begun to break away from the Federation, adding to the competition, and Jeang Yi Sao knew her advantageous negotiating position wouldn't last for long. She managed to make a deal to retain a small fleet of ships and sailors to run a legal business, and lived until the age of 69. Number 2. Maximillian Robespierre is one of the most controversial and divisive figures in history. He's known for presiding over the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, but he could also be considered one of the driving forces that kept the revolution alive. Robespierre began his career as a lawyer, arguing against capital punishment. He had some progressive views for the time period and spoke on topics such as the poor treatment of illegitimate children and women in academic spaces. He was elected as a representative for the Third Estate and the Estates General, a parliament that had no real power. It wasn't long after Robespierre was elected that the French Revolution began in earnest. He became an important political figure as various governmental bodies replaced one another during a time of chaos. He continued to make progressive arguments about equality under the law and all men in the country getting a vote, but all the while he was becoming more and more radical. Robespierre was part of the Jacobin Club, an anti-monarchy political organization that wanted to take the revolution to extremes. After the king was captured, there was a debate about what to do with him. Some simply wanted to exile the royal family, while others wanted him to remain in prison. Despite arguing against capital punishment before, Robespierre argued that the king should not live if the revolution was to survive. The king wouldn't be the last person that Robespierre sent to the guillotine. It soon became clear, to him at least, that there were more people who would bring about the end of the revolution if they were allowed to live. His political enemies were often the target of these campaigns, but ordinary citizens were also feeling the consequences of the Reign of Terror. People who thought the Jacobin Club was going too far would often find themselves arrested. Expressing fear about the current situation could be labeled as thinking anti-revolutionary thoughts, and they could get a citizen in trouble with the so-called Committee for Public Safety. Another area where Robespierre...
Make no mistake about it, bro. They abused their powers back then. If they even had a whiff of thinking you were going against them, they was going to make an example out of you in the most harshest, craziest public manner that they could possibly do. Like, and they didn't even have to have evidence to prove whatever it is they believe that you done to them. They just handed it out. Handed out orders to have this done to you, and then have you displayed in front of everybody else. Like, I'm always in awe of just how things went down back then, man. Some of it still exists today. So sad to say.
Went against his former arguments, concerned the right to trial. Many people who were arrested would never get any trial at all. The trials that did take place could not be considered fair trials. Thousands of people lost their lives during the Reign of Terror. Many would pass away in prison due to the horrendous conditions there, while many more met a more gruesome end. Robespierre's reign could only last a couple of years before he would finally be brought down. He'd handed out punishments to even those revolutionaries who'd once been his close friends, and everyone in the French government knew that they were no longer safe. In July of 1794, he warned that there was a conspiracy against the revolution and against him. He claimed that there were members of the National Convention who were part of the conspiracy. Whether or not he knew about a genuine conspiracy is unclear, but the National Convention acted quickly. The following day, Robespierre and his remaining allies were arrested, and days later he would lose his life in the same manner as many of his own enemies. Number 1. There are few more horrifying figures from history than Tamor the Lame, the first ruler of the Tamura dynasty. The conqueror was feared by nobility and peasants alike, and few crossed him who would live. It's not clear whether Tamor the Lame was the descendant of the infamous Genghis Khan himself, or simply the descendant of a cousin, but Tamor the Lame definitely took after the more famous Mongol leader in terms of his backstory. From an early age, Timur showed leadership skills and a willingness to play outside the rules. He led a band of other youths to raid travelers of goods and animals. Even before his rise to power, he was causing fear for those who traveled through the area where he and his family lived. A young Timur also showed skill with weapons and worked as a mercenary and then a military leader in southern Persia. At some point in the 1360s, Timur would gain the wounds that earned him the nickname Tamor the Lame, and then Tamerlane. Some sources claim that he'd been stealing from a shepherd when he was struck with arrows that left him permanently disabled. Others say that he received the wounds while acting as a mercenary. Whichever was the case, he suffered damage to his right leg and hand and would never fully recover. It wasn't long into his adulthood that he started to look to gain power for himself. The instability of the area, which was constantly battling with its neighbors, meant that Tamerlane could gain power by allying with various claimants and supporting them in their conquest. He then started to carve out space for himself, using the people he put in power as figureheads. By the 1370s, Tamerlane was ruling in his own right and looking to expand his empire. He fought against his former brother-in-law and friend, defeating him and taking over the land he'd helped the other man conquer. He spread his influence in all directions, using both his connection to Genghis Khan and his religion to try to influence people. He claimed that he was fighting on behalf of God, but that didn't stop him from attacking and ruining some of the most significant cities in the Islamic world. When a city showed him resistance, there was little hope of survival for those inside. There are countless stories of Tamerlane giving his soldiers a quota of the number of skulls they had to collect. They were then piled up in towers outside the city as a warning of what would happen if anybody else tried to resist. He left behind a legacy as one of the scariest individuals in history, who may have caused the passing of over 1 million people, but he started a dynasty that ruled for hundreds of years.